Hi, everyone. I'm David Cochran, and this is the Power and Politics podcast for Friday, February 5th. Vassy is away. On the pod today, troubling new details emerge in the case of Corey Hearne. He's the man accused of threatening the Prime Minister in a Rideau Hall incident last summer. Well, Hearne pleaded guilty today to 8 charges. A former deputy RCMP commissioner is here to react. Plus, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau addresses what he calls a lot of anxiety and a lot of noise over the country's vaccine rollout. Despite supply delays, he insists Canada is on track to meet vaccine targets. MPs will discuss that later. And finally, William Shatner joins us to reflect on the life and legacy of fellow Canadian actor Christopher Plummer. But first, the CBC's Catherine Tunney with the latest on Corey Hearne. Kat, thanks for doing this. You listened in on the court appearance today. What did we learn about what Corey Hearne was trying to do?
Well, David, we learned that he didn't have much of a plan, but that Corey Hearne wanted to make a statement. And when you consider the arsenal of weapons that he had on him that day, quite a chilling statement at that. So what we heard today was the agreed statement of facts. So basically, the evidence that both sides have agreed to, yes, this happened. Hearne actually himself said, yes, this is what I said, and this is what happened. So it was almost a moment-by-moment breakdown of what happened and the conversation that he had with the police officers who approached him on that day back in July when he breached the gate at Rideau Hall. So essentially, he rams the gate, as we know. The airbag deploys, there's smoke everywhere. He gets out. Surveillance footage picks him up, kind of loading up with his weapons, and he heads out on foot. Eventually, a police officer approaches him and asks him to put his weapons down, to disarm, and Hearne says, "No, I can't do that." Eventually, another officer comes over too, and then they talk to him for about 90 minutes, and he kind of opens up, and they get a kind of a slice of where his mindset is at in this very tense moment. So he talks about wanting to make a statement by showing up at one of the Prime Minister's media briefings. I think you and I and watchers of the show are quite familiar with that image, right? Of Trudeau coming out and talking to Canadians in front of Rideau Hall. So he wanted to make a statement on one of those days. He was concerned about COVID lockdown. He had lost his job. Apparently, he did not qualify for the benefits. We learned that in court today. He was concerned with what he thought the direction was going in. He was also quite angry at the government's ban on assault-style weapons. So he wanted to make his thoughts known to Trudeau on that, carrying a lot of weapons with him.
You're right. So he shows up heavily armed, heavily motivated. He's trying to get to one of the Rideau Cottage news conferences where the Prime Minister would be there, and our friends and colleagues, had it been happening. Luckily, there was no event that day. But you've mentioned weapons. Some of the details you sent today were pretty chilling, like a bullet being in the chamber of one of his guns. Tell us about the weapons that he was carrying.
Yes, we heard about 5 weapons today that he was charged with. So he had 2 loaded shotguns with him. Police say at one point he had one kind of pointing it down at the ground while he was talking to officers and another strapped kind of on him. And then other firearms were laid out on the ground where they were talking to him. So 3 of them he did not have a license for. So there was a high-standard revolver, an M14 rifle, and a break-open pistol that he did not have license for. He also was carrying high-capacity magazines, also charged with that. So those weapons kind of make up the bulk of what he pleaded guilty to today. So it's basically a purpose. Sorry, he was possessing guns for the purpose of causing danger to the public peace. So that is what he pleaded to today. Okay,
Catherine, thank you so much. And you can read a detailed report on our webpage from Catherine. Thanks so much, Catherine.
Thank you.
Okay, to the latest news now on the vaccine rollout. The Prime Minister repeated his promise to Canadians today that anyone who wants a vaccine will get one by September. That target has been in doubt recently due to cuts in vaccine deliveries from both Pfizer and Moderna. Here's Trudeau speaking earlier.
The turbulence week over week that we're seeing is of concern, and we're watching it closely and we're staying on it. But let me reassure people, we are still very much on track, as promised, to get those 6 million doses by the end of March, because that's what the vaccine company CEOs keep telling me.
So is the Prime Minister's word and the word of pharmaceutical CEOs enough for Canadians to pin their hopes on? Stephen McKinnon is the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Public Services and Procurement. John Barlow is an Alberta Conservative MP and a member of the Standing Committee of Health. And Don Davies is the NDP health critic. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you, David.
Thanks for having me.
Steve McKinnon, I'd like to start with you today. A lot of reassurance from the Prime Minister, and I'm sure some Canadians are looking for reassurance, but a lot are looking for results. How confident are you that these delivery targets are going to be met by the end of the first quarter, given that the week-to-week numbers seem to change with great frequency and never in the right direction?
Well, I would take issue with the premise of that question, David, and good evening to my colleagues and to you. Thank you for having me on. Indeed, 1.4 million doses of vaccine have already entered Canada and presumably have gone into the system of immunizations in the provinces and territories. We expect those deliveries to continue, as the Prime Minister said, through March, where 6 million doses of already approved vaccines will have arrived, and then ramping up rather significantly in the second quarter of the year and again in the third, such that every Canadian who wishes to have a vaccine will have one. We have enough doses of Pfizer and Moderna vaccines ordered, contracted for on behalf of the Canadian people, to vaccinate every Canadian who wishes to have one. Of course, if additional vaccine candidates were to be approved, AstraZeneca and others that we've had encouraging clinical data from clinical trial data, then those would be added as we progress through the year to those totals and would be shipped to the provinces. And that would, of course, redouble the logistical requirements of the provinces to vaccinate people. So look, we're confident. We set this course last summer of diversifying our vaccine supply, and within that vaccine supply, manufacturers, manufacturing locations. And of course, those manufacturers are ramping up to meet the crushing demand of the entire world. And we are pushing just as hard as any country, believe you me, to get those doses on Canadian soil. We feel the urgency.
Right.
We understand people want these vaccines, and we are acting with great dispatch, and no one should be under any illusions that the Canadian government isn't on the job 24 hours a day,
right,
trying to get those vaccines landed in Canada as quickly as possible.
But Mr. McKinney, if you look at this 4-week lull of the interruption in the Pfizer supplies because of upgrades in Belgium, which I know you cannot control, and the reduced deliveries from Moderna, and we know the next Moderna shipment will likely be reduced, that's about 1 million doses that haven't shown up in the anticipated time frame. And I know you have the reassurances from the drug companies that they will make the first quarter delivery deadline. But what hammer does the government of Canada have if they don't deliver the full 6 million doses? I mean, the contracts, as we understand them, say they will make their best efforts. What if their best efforts come short? What recourse does the government of Canada have? What can you do to push the drug companies?
Well, we have contracts for doses of vaccine that are on a quarterly basis. Then the vaccine companies, of course, inform us on a regular basis the pace of those deliveries within a given quarter. The companies, as you just indicated, are ramping up their manufacturing capability, not just in Europe, but around the world. Mm-hmm. And we will be continuing to receive increased numbers of doses now as we progress through the first quarter, and then, of course, ramping up significantly into the second quarter. We are given those reassurances on a very regular basis. And that's because we ask the companies for those reassurances on a regular basis. And when they have bad news to deliver, as they in fact did a couple of weeks ago with some temporary delays, we of course have to pass that along. But right now, we are reassured that those 6 million doses will be on Canadian soil before the end of March.
Mr. Barlow, I'd like to bring you in here if I could. I mean, your leader, Mr. O'Toole, has been critical of the government of this, saying that it's failing Canadians on the vaccine rollout program. But if Pfizer decides to stop production at its plant to do upgrades, and Moderna says it's having trouble scaling up to meet demand in Switzerland, is that really the government of Canada's fault when those are the only 2 vaccines that are approved for use in this country right now?
Well, I think it's a matter of, if we want to know what the the minister today was talking about obligations, that these companies have obligations to meet. We want to know what those obligations are. And if Mr. McKinnon is so confident that they're going to have delivery of these vaccines, why are they dipping into the COVAX agreement, which we know is vaccines for poorer countries?
But are you saying they shouldn't take the COVAX doses, sir? Because it was announced on September 25th of last year when Canada contributed the money. This was part of its dose procurement plan. Are you saying they should say no to these?
No, I think they have said over and over again that there's more than enough vaccines to vaccinate Canadians, and yet we've seen 0 doses delivered in the last 10 days. We want to know what obligations are part of those contracts. We've seen AstraZeneca and Pfizer release their contracts with the United States, the European Union, United Kingdom. We want to have the minister negotiate the release of those contracts for Canadians. Canadians want to see. Yes, that is correct. And Canadians want to see if those pharmaceutical companies don't meet the obligations of having the vaccines delivered at the end of this quarter, are there cash penalties? Are there any obligations for them to meet that? If they don't meet it, then what happens? And why did the government negotiate the delivery of these vaccines on a quarterly basis and not monthly like other countries? Okay, we have now heard that we are paying significantly more for vaccines than other countries, and yet we're getting fewer and fewer deliveries than those other countries. So what is in those contracts? Who negotiated it? Those are the questions that Canadians want to ask.
Okay, I want to bring Mr. Davies in here, but first, a couple of quick things. I think 180,000 doses of Moderna were delivered this week. They arrived in Canada on Thursday, and 79,000 Pfizer this week. And the AstraZeneca contract with the EU was released after a mutual negotiation, but is also...
Still, less than 10% of what we were promised.
Absolutely, not disagreeing there. But the AstraZeneca contract, Mr. Davies, may I bring you in here, released by the EU, was heavily redacted and done only through negotiations between the two contracting partners. But going back to my question about the supply... Given what we know about why Pfizer is interrupted and why Moderna is interrupted, what should the government of Canada do if those are the only two options for supply right now?
Well, first of all, Mr. Trudeau is concerned about Canadians having anxiety and is concerned about noise. Well, when a government repeatedly is not forthright and when they repeatedly are not transparent and are contradicted by the facts, this is what creates this kind of lack of confidence. If you remember back in December, it was the Ontario government that revealed that we were getting 4 million doses and 2 million from the Pfizer and Moderna contracts. That wasn't the government that told us that. This government still won't release a single contract, even though the U.S. has released both Pfizer and Moderna contracts. Brazil has...
Those are also heavily redacted too, Mr. Davies. I was on the HHS website looking at this, and there's gray box after gray box after gray box. So it's not like everything is out there.
I'd take a redacted contract at this point, because we haven't seen a word of a single contract. So let's just start with that. And by the way, the EU negotiated with AstraZeneca to release part of that. Look, I don't want the whole contract, but I think Canadians have a right to see some basic details. How many doses are we getting? By when? What is the delivery schedules? Those are the kind of things that taxpayers deserve a right to see. Now, I remember last year when Mr. Trudeau talks about credibility, last August, he told Canadians we'd be producing vaccines domestically in this country by the end of last year. He's also told us that EU export exemptions won't apply to us, but we're not on the exemptions list. And then he tells us we have enough vaccines by Pfizer and Moderna to vaccinate every Canadian by September, but then he dips into a fund for 2 million vaccines that is set up, let's face it, primarily to help poor countries. So if there's a credibility problem, if there's anxiety, it's squarely at the foot of this Prime Minister and the government, who have done a poor job negotiating and communicating on this issue.
Mr. McKinnon, just because we're running out of time, on the COVAX doses, it's 1.9 million doses, roughly at minimum, between now and June of AstraZeneca's yet to be approved vaccine. There's been a lot of criticism internally and globally of Canada's decision to take that, because even though an equal amount will go to a low-income or developing country under COVAX, by taking these doses, those are doses that could have gone to more doses could have gone to low-income countries. Was this the right move for Canada? Or are you worried about the implications this has on our reputation as a good global citizen?
Well, once again, it's a circular argument, David, because COVAX functions only if wealthier countries, developed countries, access some portion of their procurements through the COVAX facility. The Part A I like to talk about, such that Part B has negotiating leverage to negotiate on behalf of developing countries and to deliver doses that are paid for, it must be said, by Canadian taxpayers. So Canadians should be very proud of their leadership role.
They aren't.
It's a question of sequencing, though, right?
Canadians should be very Canadians.
The reputation's already tarnished.
That we were among the leaders in this multilateral institution. The United States aren't even members. I hear things about the G7. The United States aren't even members of COVAX. Canada put its money on the table for the developing
Took
world
vaccines
as part of the COVAX facility, and that is because COVAX works as a buying group that requires leverage. So Canada devoting some of its procurement of vaccines through COVAX is specifically the point of COVAX.
Okay, gentlemen, unfortunately, we're out of time. I'm going to have to let you go. We will, I'm certain, have you back to talk about vaccines in the future. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, David.
Have a good weekend, guys.
Okay, we're going to take a look now at how Canada compares to other countries in this race to vaccinate. Israel remains ahead of the pack with more than 60% of its population receiving at least the first dose. Most G7 nations are also administering injections at a faster pace than Canada. The United Kingdom is vaccinating its population at nearly 8 times the rate of this country. The U.S., Italy, Germany, and Belgium also outpace Canada, where 2.7% of the population has received at least one dose. Okay, we're going to go back to our top story now, and that's the man accused of ramming his truck through a gate at Rideau Hall last July pleaded guilty in court today. Corey Huron entered his guilty pleas to 8 charges, including 7 weapons-related offenses. According to the agreed statement of facts, Huron was carrying 5 weapons, including 3 which are banned or restricted in this country. A sentencing hearing is set for February 23rd. Now, we also learned that he had planned to show up to one of Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's daily media briefings. So what do the details of the incident indicate about the level of security around the Prime Minister and the threats he might face? Pierre-Yves Bourdois is a former Deputy Commissioner of the RCMP, and he joins me now from Ottawa. PY, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure, David.
I'd like to start with the charges and the end result of this. He was originally charged with, I think, 21 or 22 charges, Mr. Huron was, but he only pled guilty to 8, 7 of which were weapons-related. What do we make of this reduction in the number of charges against him?
Well, obviously, there was a pretty solid case in relation to what has transpired, but police investigation normally, when they, at the outset, they gathered as much evidence as possible. They present the evidence to the prosecutor, and then there are negotiation along the way. And at times, it happens that some of these charges are set aside to secure a conviction or a guilty plea on the most serious charges. In this particular instance, as you've indicated, 7 out of 8 charges were weapons related.
Okay, and today, you know, the weapons obviously were an alarming part, right? But we also learned that he wanted to make a statement to the Prime Minister by showing up at one of his media briefings outside Rideau Cottage. I mean, the Prime Minister is there. He's got some security, but there's political staff, there's journalists there. I mean, what was the potential had he been successful?
Well, first and foremost, you have to bear in mind it was July 2nd. There was nobody on the ground per se, and the individual, the intruder, basically just showed up there and obviously was misinformed in relation to the environment per se. But the quick reaction by the RCMP at the time, they actually managed to secure the environment and actually engage in negotiation. So from the moment this individual tried to, go through the gate at Rideau Hall, and the moment he was apprehended without incident, 2-hour time lapse, and without major incidents. So ostensibly, it was a good police operation per se, but there were a lot of variables at play when this whole thing unraveled.
Yeah, it seems like a bit of luck that he had kind of the wrong day, potentially, if you think about it, right? Because if he gets into this event or somehow gets close to this event, I mean, the Prime Minister has security there. What's his detail supposed to do in something like that? I mean, my understanding is they take care of the VIP and kind of everyone else is exposed. I mean, there was real risk there for political staff and journalists had he shown up on a proper day.
I agree with you, but what you have to bear in mind also, David, is that there were over $2 million invested in security around the Rideau Hall premise, especially given that our current Prime Minister have decided to relocate on one Sussex on the ground of Rideau Hall as opposed to going to 24 Sussex. So there was already beefed up security with regards to technology and detection. And of course, if the Prime Minister is in a public area, then there's more security details that are in close proximity to the Prime Minister, just to ensure his safety and security, along with journalists or other people near the Prime Minister.
Some of the details that came out is that Corey Hearne lost his business. He was denied CERB. There was reporting in places like the Toronto Star that he maybe dabbled in some internet conspiracies, which is a common thread in a lot of security incidents we're seeing more and more. I mean, for example, the January 6th incidents at the Capitol in the United States. We've had a group called the Canadian Revolution camped out trying to make citizens arrests of politicians here in Ottawa last summer. I mean, what does all of this tell you about the security environment and the dynamic that politicians are facing right now?
It's concerning as Canadian, and from experience, David, I can tell you that whatever is happening south of the border normally migrates north of the border, and it takes normally about a year and a half. So, and you look at, for instance, the Proud Boys that this week was put on the on terrorist list. So there are different dynamic, and the RCMP and security details are adjusting to this dynamic. I know for a fact that the RCMP, for instance, has centralized security for VIPs and major events, just to ensure that they have the clear picture, just to ensure that events or our Prime Minister or elected official can go about their business without being disturbed.
Yeah, dangerous, difficult times. PY Bourgeois, thank you so much for your expertise. We appreciate your time.
My pleasure, David.
So the Prime Minister was also asked today about allegations that have surfaced against former top military commander General Jonathan Vance. Vance is being investigated for misconduct involving 2 female subordinates. CBC News has learned the Trudeau and Harper governments both knew allegations of sexual impropriety were leveled against the former Chief of Defence Staff. Here is what Prime Minister Trudeau had to say about that today.
First of all, obviously, the new Chief of Defence Staff, Art MacDonald, has announced there will be a review into this specific situation. But I can say that from the very beginning, this government has made it very, very clear that everyone in this country, particularly working for the government, particularly working for the Canadian Armed Forces, deserves a safe and secure work environment free from any harassment.
Okay, to the economy now. And the second wave of this pandemic has taken a devastating toll on the country's economy. Job numbers for the month of January were 5 times worse than expected. Lockdowns and restrictions led to 213 job losses last month. That pushed the jobless rate up 0.6 percentage points to 9.4%, the highest level since August. Almost all of the job losses were in Ontario and Quebec, and that drop was offset by job gains in a few provinces. Okay, so for a closer look at what the job numbers mean, we're joined by Peter Armstrong, CBC's senior business correspondent, and Armin Yalnizyan is an economist and fellow with the Atkinson Foundation. Welcome to you both.
Hi. Hey guys, how's it going?
It's great. Peter, I want to start with you. Why was the drop in job numbers so much higher than anticipated?
Well, I mean, the anticipation is often just a guess, right? The range went from, I think, 40,000 jobs lost all the way. Desjardins was calling for like 300,000 lost. And the problem here was we just didn't have a gauge for how bad the economic hit would be. We knew it was going to be a hit. We knew things were bad in December, and it got worse into January. You don't need to be an economist to figure that out. Go outside. You can see all those shops are closed. All those people have been laid off. The question was, how bad has it hit? And it hit pretty bad, obviously. And again, the interesting thing in this isn't just that it hit or that it hit hard, it's who it hit. It hit, once again, the most vulnerable, the most precarious workers in Canada. These were all part-time jobs. So think about all those people that string together a bunch of part-time jobs to try to just make enough to pay the rent every month. They got hit the hardest. Women, people of color, specific sectors that are very vulnerable, they're the ones that got hit the hardest for this.
Yeah, Armin, I wonder if you can pick up on that point, because that is no surprise to you, right? You have been warning about this very trend in the job market since the very beginning of this. You coined the phrase she-cession. It's the people, yet again, who can least afford it who are being hit the hardest.
Indeed. In fact, yesterday, another unlikely suspect, the Toronto Dominion Bank's economics department, put out a report, "It's worse than you think," which is a really cute play on the old Scotiabank slogan. But it was worse than we thought. It was much worse than we thought. And in fact, when you take a look at, you mentioned right off the top, David, that the majority of job losses were in Ontario and Quebec. Ontario accounted for 72% of all the job losses, like just by itself. And the more the pandemic continues, the infection rate fails to be controlled, the more we're going to see these non-essential industries having to shut down. And it just goes on and on and on. And the longer it goes on, as Dan Kelly famously said at the Canadian Federation of Independent Businesses, there's been a lot of deaths. They just haven't had the funerals yet. So there's a lot of businesses that will not withstand this, which will make it harder for these marginalized workers. We're working in marginalized businesses to get in. In fact, in Ontario, the employment rate for women of all working age is now just a shade over 53%. Last time we saw that rate of employment for women was in 1991. We've got to do better than this. We've got to get onto the other side of the pandemic and get more people into the job market, or else we're going to be looking at a protracted downturn.
Peter, I don't want to sugarcoat this because, a couple 100,000 job losses is terrible, especially for the people affected. But when you look at it, it's not a structural problem in the economy. It's almost lockdown, pandemic, COVID related. Like, again, not trying to take away from the seriousness of it. Is there any hope in that as vaccines roll out and as case spread declines, that some of this can come back perhaps with a bit of a bounce?
Yes, there's great hope. And we're in that part now where you can see the light at the end of the tunnel, and it's coming. That doesn't mean that this is going to be simple or smooth or just flip a switch and everybody goes back to work, Dave. That's the hard part here is I was talking to an economist today who's saying it's going to go like this. We're going to see more waves. We're going to see more disruption. And again, those people at the bottom are going to be hit the hardest. So a couple of things. One, Armin is entirely right that economic policy is pandemic policy and pandemic policy is economic policy. You cannot separate the two. You got to sort that out. The other thing that we're all starting to look at now, or people have been smarter than me, have been looking at it for a long time, is how do you get people back to work safely? How do you get those frontline workers into jobs that are more exposed? How do you get all those office towers filled again? So we need to start getting now our heads around what rapid testing is going to look like, what contact tracing is going to look like, because we're not doing any of that because we're just in the midst of dealing with the immediacy of the crisis now. So we've really got to start planning now what the spring and what the summer and what the fall are going to look like. But you're right. We can see that light. It's coming. It just isn't going to be a flick of a switch and all of a sudden everything's great, though.
So, Armin, on that point, what is the sort of thing we need our politicians and our governments to do to get us to this light at this end of this still very long tunnel? Because, the focus here is vaccines very heavily, but our better income support programs need better aid programs for businesses. What do we need to see in the interim?
Oh, David, I thought you would never ask. It's the same song that I've been singing since the summer. No recovery without a she-covery, no she-covery without childcare. My friend, early learning and childcare is the secret sauce to hastening recovery and laying a foundation for future potential. We don't do that, and we don't do it right. We are not going to maximize growth. And governments at every level are being told, don't worry about the deficit, worry about maximizing growth. It's not a magic bullet. It will not solve all of our problems. For example, all those marginal businesses that I was talking about, businesses operating on less than 5% margins that cannot withstand a 50 to 70% loss of revenues. Some of those businesses are gone and gone for good. So it isn't flicking a switch after the pandemic. Those jobs aren't coming back. But you can at least mitigate the part of the recovery that is policy amenable. And that's got a big label on it called early learning and childcare. Not just childcare, not just warehousing your kids, because the last thing we want to do is create another vector of care in the caring economy that looks like the long-term care facilities. Last thing we want to do. But we can create a really good, robust system right now that will train people, hire people, that will actually get people back in the labor market and let people that are being offered jobs or need childcare to do their jobs, do their jobs. So it's a win-win.
Okay. There's a lot more to talk about. We're going to have to leave it there, but I'm sure we're going to have you back. Peter, Armin, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Legendary Canadian actor Christopher Plummer has died at the age of 91. Plummer grew up in Montreal and enjoyed a distinguished career in theater, movies, and television. He won an Oscar, 2 Emmys, and 2 Tonys.
Edelweiss, Edelweiss.
And the Oscar goes to Christopher Plummer, Beginners.
Sound of Music came out in 1965 and, of course, is considered to be a classic film. Plummer said over the years he hated the movie and found it awful and sentimental. In 2012, when he was 87, he became the oldest actor to win an Oscar for his role in Beginners, where he played a man who comes out as gay after the death of his wife. He died at his home in Connecticut of complications from a fall at the age of 91. Well, William Shatner is also a beloved Canadian actor and international star. He knew and worked with Christopher Plummer, and Mr. Shatner joins us now from Los Angeles. William Shatner, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Pleasure to be with you.
I think the first time I ever saw you work with Christopher Plummer was in Star Trek VI, where you played Captain Kirk, of course, and he played General Chang, the Klingon, Shakespeare-quoting Klingon with the eye patch riveted to his face. How did that come about, that you guys hooked up in a Star Trek movie?
I dimly remember his name being suggested for the role, and I jumped at the chance. We had our lives had intertwined most of our adult life. I from Montreal, as he is, and I played in several of the theaters that he played in. He was a couple of years, a little older than I was, and in those formative years, those earlier or later years were important in that I went to McGill, and he was already a professional actor. So I was a while behind him, both on radio at the CBC out of Montreal, the Canadian Repertory Theatre in Ottawa he went to, and I was there for several years. And then he had moved on to Toronto, as I did a few years later, and then on to Stratford, which I did a few years later. And then he, I believe, went to London and had a distinguished career on the West End. And I ended up in New York on Broadway, and then I continued on to Hollywood and made my life basically in Hollywood while he was traveling in between. We would see each other from time to time, and I had admired him from the very beginning. He had this elegance about him, the way he looked. He was this handsome, wonderful man with the great manners and the English accent and the clothing and everything. He just was. He was everything I wasn't. And at Stratford, he was admirable, and I was holding on to whatever I could hold on to. He was admirable, and I admired him so.
You were his understudy at one point. Is that not true? In a Shakespeare production,
he
was
played Henry V. He got sick, and I went on for one performance for Henry V without any rehearsal. So I went on in one of the longest roles in the English theater without any rehearsal. I didn't even know the other actors particularly, but I had, for reasons that I won't go into, had learned the words, and so I spoke the words and hardly knew the choreography. But we laughed about that over the years. The time I got to know him best of all, strangely, was I revisited Stratford. I was directing and acting in or being part of a documentary.
This is The Captains, right? About Star Trek.
That's correct. And so I asked to interview him, and he was at Stratford. I don't know whether he was living up there or not, but in any case, I visited with him for an afternoon. And we spent the most delightful afternoon talking and walking and being part of Stratford. I had been so in awe of everything. In the theater at Montreal, being at Stratford, I was like wide-eyed. And my eyes gradually closed through experience and age. And I was able to see with a little more reality what I was looking at. And so I was able to be with him on the same level, if you will. Mm-hmm. I felt friendship rather than admiration, or both. And we played with each other on this interview. We laughed and joked, and it was so much fun, and all our mutual experiences, actors we had performed with, and jokes we had played on each other, and roles we had played, and the understudy thing, and everything came together on that magical afternoon that I spent with him. No,
go ahead. Go ahead.
Sorry.
No, go ahead. Go ahead. I cut you off.
No, and then ellipse.
He acted right up. He was acting right up until the end, right? I mean, he was 91 when he passed. I saw a movie he did recently called Knives Out that came out 2 years ago. So he was like 88, 89 when he did this.
That's incredible to be acting at that age.
Right. Like he did the stage, as you talked about, like Henry V did Shakespeare, but he also was a voice actor for video games, things like Skyrim and things on Xbox. Like he changed with the times, right? So
I hope so.
Yeah, when you look at his legacy, big picture, and, you know, there's a sense of loss and a sense of pride in this country today. How do you think Canadians and the world should remember Christopher Plummer when they look back at the totality
as one of the most distinguished actors that ever that lived anywhere? He was more familiar in the theater in London, I believe, but as a result of his films and on television, he was the American public was well acquainted with him, but he was a formidable talent in many ways. He spoke. You know, we used to joke about John Gielgud and the way they would do Shakespeare, and Chris could do that without being. Putting it on like I do. He could do that in reality. And at the same time, he could play comedy extraordinarily well because he was very funny. He was a magnificent actor. And the parts that I knew of Chris Plummer were admirable. And I have a sense, I haven't seen him in many years, but I have a sense of loss. And it's one of those people, and I urge your audience to partake of my experience, which is don't let time go by. If you have an old friend or somebody who is passing you by and you wish to know them a little bit better, take advantage of the moment, because you never know when they'll pass on or you'll pass on. Take advantage of the moment. And I wish I had more often with Chris.
No, that is excellent advice, especially given the age we've been living in for the past year. Well, William Shatner, thank you so much for taking this moment to remember your friend and colleague with us here on Power and Politics. Thank you very much.
Pleasure to talk to you. Thank you.
That is William Shatner. And there's lots of political reaction here at home to Christopher Plummer's death. We've been getting statements from people on this all day since the news broke. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau writes, Mr. Plummer was a timeless actor who entertained millions around the world and inspired many to pursue the arts. A true gentleman and a consummate professional, his presence both on and off the stage will be thoroughly missed. On behalf of all Canadians, I extend my deepest condolences to his family, his friends, and his many fans. Conservative leader Erin O'Toole tweeted, my thoughts are with Christopher Plummer's family and loved ones during this difficult time. Thank you for sharing this legendary actor and Canadian icon with us as he graced stages like those in Stratford, Ontario, and the screens in our living rooms. Alberta Premier Jason Kenney tweeted, rest in peace, Christopher Plummer, one of the world's greatest actors and a truly great Canadian. And Historica Canada tweeted a Canadian political connection. Christopher Plummer, a great-grandson of Prime Minister Sir John Abbott and an international star in film and on television, has passed away. Plummer was a man of many talents, too long to list in a tweet. The Power Panel is here with me, Paul, Marty, Marie, and Nigan. All right, Paul, I want to come back to you. The Prime Minister said vaccine delays were expected. The government planned for them. Our colleague Ryan Tumulty said to him today, is like, is this your plan? I mean, if there is a plan, should they be more transparent about what it includes?
They should be a lot more transparent. I should point out that on the job losses, the United States also suffered punishing job losses this month, even though their vaccine delivery effort is going surprisingly, almost inexplicably well. I mean, because this is a system that Joe Biden didn't implement. It's the one that he inherited from the other guy, and it's going well. But despite that, the jobs numbers are gross on both sides of the border. This has been a depressing week for people who wish that their government would simply tell them a straight story. It began with an extraordinary article from the Huffington Post about a backbench Liberal MP, Francis Scarpaleggia, nicest guy in the country, wanted to ask a simple question about delivery of personal protective equipment, and 10 staffers jumped on that question and wrestled it to the ground and took out entirely innocuous language. It's not entirely surprising that a government that is that obsessed with marketing in as obscure a corner of government effort as friendly questions from government backbenchers in question period might take its eye off the ball when it comes to delivering actual services to actual Canadians.
Yeah, you can't stop Francis Scarpaleggia. You can only hope to contain him. But, Marie, on the inability to sort of give this straight answer that Paul references, at committee, Anita Anand explained in detail why AstraZeneca wouldn't make vaccines here. They didn't feel Canada could scale up to the level they wanted. Not an answer the government has given plainly and publicly, despite all of the questions about it. So is this a communications problem? Are they truly hamstrung by the contracts? I mean, why can't they just explain themselves in a clear, simple fashion on issues of such urgency?
I think part of it is probably, to be fair, in the contracts. When we asked them specific questions about how much we paid, did Israel pay more than us, and is that why they're getting more vaccines? That could be, to be fair, something they don't want to share. And also in terms of competitiveness and negotiations. But you're right, Minister Anand often has very good answers, not necessarily answers people want, but explanations to certain things that are going on. And the Prime Minister, especially today, just sort of repeats the same thing over and over again. Just trust me, and I promise you everything will be fine. But the pressure is augmenting from citizens, but also from provinces. Yesterday, in Justin Trudeau's phone call with his provincial counterparts, people were not happy. They haven't been happy. They're still not happy. People were requesting also to see the contracts. They said, well, show them to us. We'll keep confidentiality, but tell us what's going on. We need predictability. You have the health minister in Quebec saying, we're ready to vaccinate, but nothing's happening. We're just stuck waiting. It's like having a brand new car without any gas in it. You do get the sense that the frustrations are growing. And even in his call with the premiers, the Prime Minister apparently didn't have much answers to give them or much details as to, the deliveries that are coming, when they're coming, any reassurances. And he essentially just told them, well, at least when you guys do your own pressers, help me and help me reassure people that everything is good. Don't complain about me. It's an odd communications strategy. And you're right. If Minister Anand can give pointed answers to questions and at least not give us all the information, but some, you have to wonder why more in the government don't do it to help people trust them.
Yeah, Marty, I'm not sure they're not telling the provinces when X number of doses are going to come on which date because they are trying to keep it secret. I don't think they have.
Those numbers are changing. They're not explaining why those numbers are changing, and the provinces are quite frustrated about it.
Right, but I think if they had, my sense is if they had that answer, Marty, I want to bring you in here that they would provide that. I mean, they did give the updated schedules last week on Moderna deliveries, and Alberta and Saskatchewan went public with statements condemning the federal government for failing on vaccine supply. But on this issue of contracts, we keep getting compared to the U.S., we keep getting compared to Europe, which have done some disclosure, but they're also very heavily redacted, right? I mean, what you're seeing from the United States is not the raw, unfiltered contract. The same with the AstraZeneca in the European Union. So, I mean, where's the balancing act here for Canada on what it can and should disclose?
It's a commercial contract. You're not going to see all of it. It's like anything. It's like having a contract between Air Canada and Bell Helicopter. You're not going to be able to see that because there are commercial interests within that they're not going to disclose. It's not in their interest to do that. There's an interesting bit almost of messaging here. I look at what Francois Legault does. He comes out every day and he's gained this almost reputation of father knows best, basically not having to explain himself in terms of details, in terms of hard numbers or anything like that, but just basically saying this is what we have to do and this is the way it's going to be. And people have been surprisingly okay with that here in Quebec. It's almost like Trudeau is trying a little bit of the same thing right now, and it just isn't working for whatever reason. I don't know if it's because of his personality. I don't know if it's the fact because the federal government. And I'm not sure. Maybe it's because of the provincial governments are saying everything's fine here. It's the federal government's fault. But all is to say is that it's not really working for Mr. Trudeau.
Nigan, I get the sense that the Prime Minister's office and the federal government knows they're in for a rough couple of weeks of vaccine deliveries. They're sort of in the middle of the trough now. They think they're going to come out of this around February 15th when Pfizer starts to come back to normal, and they're just going to have to grin and bear it until that point in time and try to reassure the country. And I think that's what we kind of saw today.
And I can't believe that anyone hasn't mentioned the absolute rockabye baby kind of tone that Justin Trudeau had today, which was slower than usual, had much more cadence and rhythm than usual. I mean, it was a very careful walking through of everything is fine. And then on top of that, and I'm certainly no language expert by any means, but he said specifically in French, everybody will get a vaccine. And he didn't repeat that same statement within the English translation that he was presenting. So, I mean, he's really speaking directly to particular areas of the country regionally. And in the messaging here, it seems like the messaging should be an easy one. It should be basically set up a website, show everyone at what point will they be vaccinated, what group will go in which direction, what's the numbers looking like. You almost don't need the contracts when it comes to that because then the secrecy seems to be lifted. But this government seems to be having great trouble by dealing with a sort of a trust me tone, a trust me message when it is very, very evident, particularly across the world, in Europe as well, that the rollout for the vaccine everywhere seems to be going almost predictably, unexpectedly.
Yeah, I think he said everyone wants a vaccine by September. Will get one off the top of his speech in English and then repeated all of the reassurances at the end in French. So he sort of opened with a bookend of English comfort and ended with a bookend of French comfort. But, you know, Paul, on the contract question, just before we take a quick break, I mean, do you buy the government's argument that there's risk here, that if you release too much details, you jeopardize these relationships? And given the global demand for vaccines and the urgency and the competing interests, that it just exposes Canada, the transparency could expose Canada to risk?
I actually think that's valid. I think on the list of things I think this government is screwing up, not publishing the contracts is pretty low on my list. Pretty high on my list is a prime minister who comes out and reassures Canadians in the morning, and then over the course of the day, the substance of his reassurance is walked back by other ministers or by the public service. He made claims about the AstraZeneca delivery this morning that were disowned before lunch by the public service. The Globe and Mail asked the embassy in Washington, has this government asked the Biden administration for some of the vaccine that they seem to be so good at producing? And nobody in this government will answer.
Yeah, the Prime Minister, we're told, misspoke when he said 20 million doses of AstraZeneca will be here by June. We're told that's a conflation of the combined 20 million Moderna and Pfizer that are coming by June, or a misstatement of the 2 million AstraZeneca they expect to get through the COVAX
The great thing is
agreement.
The misstatement is always reassuring and carried live on television by this government's most spectacular public relations asset. And then it is denied later by people you've never heard of, who aren't on camera. It's becoming a pattern.
We're putting forward a plan and a guarantee to care for our seniors. And I want to dedicate this plan to all the families I spoke to who lost loved ones.
That's NDP leader Jagmeet Singh launching his party's first platform plank today on a national long-term care strategy. A poll out today from Abacus Data shows the NDP running more than 10 points behind the Liberals and the Conservatives, who are virtually tied. The same poll found the number of Canadians who have a positive impression of the Prime Minister has dipped to 42%. That's a 5-point drop since last month. So, should opposition parties be getting their ducks in a row for a possible spring election? The Power Panel is here with me for one last round. Nigan, Marie, Paul, and Marty. And Marty, let's start with you. When you look at those numbers, not looking great for the Prime Minister. Vaccine deliveries are bad, job numbers are down, and lockdowns have been imposed, and not surprisingly, he takes a dip. Is this the sort of thing the opposition party should try to capitalize on?
Well, a couple of things. I think as far as the NDP promise to come out and do this is actually very smart. As I said before the break, it's entirely in line with what the NDP sort of the way of thinking, that schools and hospitals and old age homes shouldn't be part of the profit motive. We had a situation here in Quebec at a residence called Heron, where, the minute that COVID hit, staff abandoned, and there was an awful tragedy that happened there. So if anything, the old age home question has sort of exposed, the pandemic has exposed the problem with old age homes in Canada. So as far as election promise, as far as the bumper sticker, I think it's great. He runs into a couple of problems with it. First of all, healthcare is a provincial jurisdiction. So, you're going to run into that maw if this ever comes into place. The other thing, too, of course, is that the Liberals can come along and steal this thing. The third thing is I think we're sitting here talking a lot of this, but one of the things that we talked about before is that, a lot of this is spring-loaded. Demand is going to come back the second there's a vaccine, and I don't want to predict the future, but Andre Picard, so I'm going to blame Andre Picard from the Globe and Mail because I stole this idea from him, was that basically fast forward 3 months from now, we're going to be swimming in vaccine. The idea that they're so overproducing right now, they're ramping up so much now that there's going to be a glut of supply. So the problems that we're talking about now could be entirely different in the spring.
Right, but Maria, I'm one of these people who is adamantly against the mere notion that there's going to be an early election, right? Like vaccine supplies could get interrupted. You can't be in caretaker mode. You can't be negotiating with drug companies for early delivery and staying on them for delivery if you're out on the campaign trail. But, when you look at the Prime Minister's numbers dipping down like that and basically neck and neck with the Conservatives, that may be a tempting option for the opposition. And even now, I've had opposition supporters texting me saying, don't rule out Trudeau trying to force this if things turn around because of vaccines. What's your sense of it?
Yeah, I don't know if I was the opposition, if I would be that eager either. You're right that the Liberals are taking a little bit of a dive because of these past few weeks and vaccine problems, but Erin O'Toole's unfavorables aren't great. He's not that well known, and the impressions so far in polling aren't, resoundingly positive. So I don't know if they're in that much of a rush. They might be thinking if they wait a little longer, people will get to know him better and like him better. I don't think it's a slam dunk for them, essentially. And if you're the NDP or the Bloc, well, if you're the NDP, it's not going that great either. If you're the Bloc, it might be going well in Quebec. But again, I'm of the thought that I don't see how you can campaign when people aren't vaccinated. These people, enjoy crowds, enjoy rallies, especially the Liberals, but also other parties, shaking hands, meeting people, being on the ground. I don't know that a Zoom campaign can be that effective, and I don't know that people would tune into a Zoom campaign when that's all we do all day at work and we already want to pull our eyeballs out. I have always been of the thought that the Liberals wouldn't necessarily want to go in an election in the spring. They would want to, but they probably shouldn't because of what has been happening these past few weeks. So I'm not surprised. They could do the gamble, yes, the vaccines start rolling out and everything's super dandy and great in April and May and June. But once you've gone into campaign mode, if things go wrong, which is not in your control, we're right back at where we are right now. I think it's pretty risky, even if they expect vaccines to, yes, come through in the next few months. I think it's pretty risky because if there's a bump in the road, that's all we're going to talk about in the campaign. And what we're seeing in polls now could very well happen again, but close to a voting day.
Nigan, I'm sure the Prime Minister's office and the Liberals are doing their polling, and they've seen private polling as well as his public polling. He has his private conversations with the premiers where he's getting the direct feedback from them. And you referenced his tone earlier today as a rockabye baby kind of cadence. He seemed to me today like a leader who knows there's a lot of unrest and anger and anxiety out there, simply because we're at this low point, probably, of the pandemic, the vaccine rollout, and just the number of cases.
And it's not just that, too. That same Abacus poll showed a 19% increase in a trusting with the government, as well as a 25% approval rate when it comes to the specific issue of rolling out the vaccine. So the public is turning on the federal government. The government is aware of this. And let's be honest here. The worst enemy of the Liberals are the Liberals. And they shoot themselves in the foot frequently. And they have done so this entire pandemic. While things started out very well, their favorability rate was fairly generally quite high. And then with the We Charity scandal, and then Bill Morneau, and now the rolling out of the vaccine, we've got a real government that's struggling within its own walls to try to keep its house in order at the same point of get its messaging across. Paul talked about the staffers contradicting the government openly. And I mean, what the NDP are doing here is they're seeing a little bit of blood in the water, a slight increase in their number, and so they want to get on the front page. And that's the fact that we're talking about their policy announcement today is evidence of the value of the policy announcement, because frankly, it's a low-hanging fruit. The issue of long-term care homes clearly is favorable amongst Canadians. Clearly, people care a lot about what's happening in long-term care facilities and the fact that they're so vulnerable. And I don't think there's anyone really cares that it's a provincial designation. I mean, Jamie Singh made in the announcement, I said specifically, we're going to privatize Rivera homes. Like, how are you going to do that? I mean, it's almost impossible. And how are you going to do that? Like, are you going to make it nationalized? Like, how are you going to do that for Rivera homes? Yep. Anyways, that being said, I think that the announcement was valuable insofar to get on the front page, and the Liberals are really, they're running a bit scared at the moment.
Oh, yeah, there's a lot of missing steps in the NDP plan from what they announced today to where you could have private or nationalized or publicized Rivera Home. But Paul, I want to bring you here for some thoughts before we wrap this up. What's your take?
That Abacus poll this morning, that was really lousy news for the Liberals. And although maybe only temporary if the vaccines come back, and was really lousy news for the NDP, except they're used to lousy news. They got rid of Tom Mulcair as their leader because he failed to deliver power, and then they forgot forever that they ever wanted to contend for power. They're pretty happy where they are in the polls, I think. But it was very, in very interesting ways. It was terrible news for Aaron O'Toole and the Conservatives. With the Liberals slumping badly, the Conservatives did not improve at all. Mm-hmm. And I wrote to David Coletto at Abacus this morning, and I said, what is the approval rating for each party leader with the people who say they're going to vote for that party? And among the Liberals, among people who say they're going to vote Liberal, support for Justin Trudeau is up over 80%. Among those who say they're going to vote for the NDP, approval of Jagmeet Singh is up over 80%. Among those who say they're going to vote Conservative, approval of Aaron O'Toole is at 62%. Now, some of that is because he's relatively new as leader, and people say they don't have an idea of what they think of him yet. But my goodness, if you're a Conservative supporter and you haven't figured out who Aaron O'Toole is by now, then you really haven't been paying attention. And that sort of enthusiasm gap is the kind of thing that Michael Ignatieff had heading into the 2011 election. It is a dreadful piece of news for a party leader if he doesn't have the people who claim to support his party behind him.
Okay, we are out of time. We're going to have to leave it there. I want to thank you all for joining us tonight. Thanks so much.
Me much. Thanks.
That's it for today. Make sure you subscribe to the pod so you don't miss any of the latest political news. And if you like this episode, share it with a friend. Thanks for listening.
For more CBC podcasts, go to cbc.ca/podcasts/podcasts/podcasts/podcasts/podcasts/podcasts/podcasts/podcasts/podcasts/podcasts/podcasts/podcasts/podcasts/podcasts/podcasts/podcasts/podcasts/podcasts/podcasts/podcasts/podcasts/podcasts/podcasts/podcasts/podcasts/podcasts/podcasts/podcasts/podcasts/podcasts/podcasts/podcasts/podcasts/podcasts/podcasts/podcasts/podcasts/podcasts/podcasts/podcasts/podcasts/podcasts/podcasts/podcasts/podcasts/podcasts/podcasts/podcasts/podcasts/podcasts/podcasts/podcasts/podcasts/podcasts/podcasts/podcasts/podcasts/podcasts/podcasts/podcasts/podcasts/podcasts/podcasts/podcasts/podcasts/podcasts/podcasts/podcasts/podcasts/podcasts/podcasts/podcasts/podcasts/podcasts/podcasts/podcasts/podcasts/podcasts/podcasts/podcasts/podcasts/podcasts/podcasts/podcasts/podcasts/podcasts/podcasts/podcasts/podcasts/podcasts/podcasts/podcasts/podcasts/podcasts/podca